Hello, I'm Emily Hawthorne, a Middle East and North Africa analyst at RANE. This podcast is brought to you by RANE Worldview, the premier digital publication for objective geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Subscribe today at stratfor.com.
This is the Essential Geopolitics podcast from RANE. I'm Emily Donahue. I read an article recently. The headline was something like, Putin is playing the long game in Ukraine and his intentions may not be clear for years. I wondered how that squares with what we know right now about Russia's operations at its border with Ukraine. Luckily, Matthew Orr is here. He's our resident expert on this topic. Welcome back to the podcast, Matthew.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
Matt, we spoke a couple of weeks ago about this crisis and how long it had been building. Our listeners can find all of our podcasts at RANE Worldview. But what's going on now? What's changed since we last spoke?
Yeah, so a couple things have changed since we last spoke. Probably the biggest of them is that Russia's buildup near Ukraine has continued unabated. If when we last spoke on January 19th, there was about 60 battalion tactical groups, which is a Russian unit consisting of about 1,000 troops. If there was about 60 of them when we last spoke, that number has grown to 80, and it's probably closer to something like 100 if you include the amount of Russian and separatist forces in the Donbass. And so that brings a total of something like as many as 130,000 Russian troops, particularly if you include things like air and naval personnel. So Russia's buildup is continuing unabated, and that's exactly what we expected, given that there's these Russian-Belarusian exercises that are coming up. The active phases of the exercises actually started on February 10th, and they run until February 20th. Those exercises provide essentially the justification or excuse for a lot of the military buildup that we've been seeing, and presumably we would see exercises conclude, unless, of course, the Russians provide a new reason or a new excuse to have these forces near Ukraine. One possible way they could do this is an agreement with the Belarusian military that's been in the works for a while, and it could be possible that new details of that agreement are unveiled that essentially allow for the semi-permanent stationing of Russian troops in Belarus, as an example. The other big change, of course, is that on the diplomatic track, we haven't seen really enough progress to make us think that Russia is inclined to significantly decrease tensions. So the U.S. Issued its formal responses to Russia's demands for security guarantees. The U.S. basically said that, we will talk to you about certain issues, ones that Russia dismissed as secondary, things like arms control and incident avoidance measures on the air and sea, and controls on exercises, transparency measures, things like that. But we didn't see any willingness by the U.S. or NATO to discuss essentially Russia's biggest demands, which revolve around the current tensions in Ukraine.
Matthew, a far-fetched question perhaps, but does anyone actually understand what Vladimir Putin really wants and how he thinks he will get it?
Yeah, this is the kind of the question that everybody's trying to answer currently. It's essentially clear that what Putin really wants at this point is Ukrainian neutrality. Basically, he wants a political decision, a political solution blocking Ukraine from joining NATO, preferably in the very long term. So basically, Russia's other security demands that it wanted, the things that I mentioned answering your previous question, it's clear that the US and NATO are willing to work with Russia on those issues. And so and basically, the U.S. was willing to give concessions in those areas. Remember that, just a few years ago, the U.S. and NATO didn't want to discuss, and the U.S. certainly didn't want to discuss arms control with Russia, but now they are. But with regards to Ukraine, it's still we're still in the same dynamic. Russia really wants, Putin really wants Ukrainian neutrality ensured in some way. And there's basically two ways that he thinks he can get that. The first way would be through a political decision by NATO. Basically, this is something like a moratorium on new NATO members for a long period, say 20, 25 years, which is something that's been discussed. It could be the form of a decision by separate members of the alliance, for example, authoritative ones like France or Germany, to unilaterally say that they will block the possibility of Ukrainian NATO membership due to other security arrangements and agreements with Russia. Or it could take another form, like some kind of political statement by the NATO alliance regarding its future plans for Ukraine. Essentially, if it doesn't formally close the open door policy, basically some sort of decision that would likely be taken during the next NATO summit, which runs from the 29th to the 30th of June, basically reframing the alliance's relationship towards Russia. The other way that Russia could achieve Ukrainian neutrality would be through the realization of the Minsk agreements according to the interpretation pushed by Moscow and the Donbass separatists. So basically the idea there is that they interpret the form of strong autonomy that would be granted to Donbass republics, these independent regions of Ukraine that have waged a low-scale war in the east of the country since 2014. As part of their reintegration in Ukraine, they would get the right to block major foreign policy decisions for the country, things like membership in alliances and so on. And so those are essentially the two paths that Putin is thinking about and looking for. And to be quite honest, he doesn't necessarily really care, which one is the one that ultimately results in Ukrainian NATO membership being blocked. All he cares about is that result is achieved in a way strong enough for Putin to eventually leave the presidency and say, I reached a stable kind of state affairs. I finished this business, and I'm not leaving such a major unresolved issue to a potential successor.
I find it hard to believe that any member of NATO would go so far as to give a proclamation that it would block any new member from joining. Doesn't that actually go against the whole purpose of NATO?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Such a declaration or such a major concession would cause catastrophic and probably irreparable damage to the alliance.
And that's what he wants, right?
And that's what he wants, as it would split the alliance between Eastern members and Western members. But again, this view is not particularly super outside of the ordinary. For example, just in the head of the Finnish Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee said that a Western politician or somebody should, like Macron, should say that they will block Ukrainian NATO membership if that's what it takes to stop a major war in Europe. And so, of course, the Russians see, steps like that and they go, oh my gosh, we're already starting to have an effect on the political discourse in Europe, and maybe eventually with long-term continued pressure could essentially become more likely in the future as we move the Overton window, if you will, of what's the conception of NATO and what's the future of security in Europe.
Matthew, I know that RANE analysts are constantly laying out and debating possible geopolitical scenarios. What are you thinking about how things could play out here, short and maybe a little bit longer term?
Yeah, that's really the key question. I think that the most likely scenario is one where Russia basically says, okay, fine, you didn't satisfy our biggest demands, but neither of the paths that we've laid out have necessarily been fully closed. And so, we will keep the diplomatic track open, even as we largely maintain leverage and say, well, we have to take certain response measures if you're not going to satisfy our demands. So, Russia could do all kinds of things to maintain tensions. This would be, things in arms control, things like continued drills and troop deployments to threatening areas near Ukraine and NATO. But it'd also probably take diplomatic steps, basically, saying that the European security framework needs major adjustments if you're not going to satisfy these demands. And so we think that the concessions that Putin has already gotten will essentially lead the Russians to realize that other options for escalation are unnecessarily costly. And to essentially not take those routes. But if Russia decides to escalate more, we think that the really next phase of escalation would be a significant escalation of the Donbass conflict, which has raged in Ukraine since 2014. The idea there would be that the Donbass separatists would likely use some kind of major incident, likely a false flag attack with mass civilian casualties, to justify a renewed separatist offensive in the area that would seek to probably seize additional territory for the self-declared republics. And this would do two things. Firstly, it would be massively destabilizing to Ukraine and would send the country into panic, because it would do the second thing, which is it would signal Russia's ability to essentially intervene in this conflict in a massive way, i.e. through an invasion of Ukraine, without Russia having to actually follow through with the very costly invasion. And so this would send fear into European capitals, and then the idea is that, France, Germany, and the US would then start pressuring Kiev to enact the Minsk agreements on terms acceptable to Moscow, as essentially the only way to prevent a Russian invasion or a long-term continuation of conflict. The next scenario is indeed a major Russian military operation against Ukraine. This could take several forms, but essentially the most likely form is an attempt to seize large pieces of Ukraine and set up a puppet government that would be loyal to Moscow. This is an extremely high-cost step because of the sanctions that the West has promised on Russia, and there's all kinds of indications that, despite the confidence often exuded by Russian officials, that this would be extremely costly for Moscow's economy and technological development in the long term, and comes with all kinds of political risks. And so we think it's doubtful that they resort to this. The final scenario is some kind of appeasement or concession scenario where, again, faced with scenarios similar to the previous ones, Western leaders basically become convinced that they should indeed give Moscow additional concessions because the results of that will be less damaging than a Russian military action against Ukraine. And so basically the West caves and gives some of the things that I mentioned earlier, things like a moratorium on new NATO members, a political declaration that, say, France or Germany will not or will block Ukrainian NATO membership, things like that. So those are kind of the most likely scenarios that we're looking at, basically in order of decreasing likelihood. But I think the real long-term takeaway is that these tensions will not just disappear. Russia, if it does not get what it wants, it is prepared to take the steps necessary to make a lot of the tension and possibly hysteria that has really gone through the West semi-permanent. It looks like we're kind of set for this conflict to linger and to not necessarily fully die down, even if this acute phase eventually passes.
That is so interesting, Matthew. Thanks so much for that analysis.
Sure thing.
Matthew Orr is a Eurasia analyst with RANE. Whether you're watching developments about Ukraine or any country, RANE Worldview is the go-to source for comprehensive geopolitical news, analysis, and intelligence. Try us out. We're offering a special rate right now. Find out more at stratfor.com. That's stratfor.com. Looking forward to having you. I'm Emily Donahue, and thanks for listening.